Okay, first person I'd like to introduce is Ute van der Heijden, who is the journal. She's sitting here in the front row. Also Hugh Leach, also Ray Walsh, and Dick Milliman, I understand, is here. And so I'd like to give them a warm welcome for coming out tonight. And I'd also like to thank our panel members who so willingly agreed to come. I think we're going to have some interesting stories from them tonight. And they will introduce themselves one by one as they come up here. Well, from the first date of publication, many early newspapers throughout our country have enabled us to look back at the history of our communities, and the Lansing State Journal was no exception. Next month, on April 28th, it will celebrate its 159th anniversary in the capital city. It has taken literally, however, thousands of people to turn out some folded, unstapled sheets of paper with news, feature stories, photos, comments, and advertising during those 159 years. People who worked in advertising and technology, accounting, human resources, production, and marketing. And let's not forget those who worked in circulation. The delivery of the final product that was peddled door to door for many years by hundreds of young boys and girls once they reached the age of 12. And more recently, by adult carriers. But tonight, my former colleagues and I are going to try and give you an intimate look at another department, editorial, the newsroom. However, before we do that, I would like to share a wee bit of State Journal history with you. The Lansing State Journal traces its lineage to the founding of the State Republican by Henry Barnes on April 28, 1855, but it was not the first newspaper in town. 7 years earlier, on January 11, 1848, John Harmon and a fellow Detroiter launched a paper known as the Free Press. It died in infancy, but a few months later, Harmon and George W. Peck, a staunch member of the Democratic Party, started the Lansing Journal. It did well for about 6 years until the birth of the Republican Party in Jackson in July of 1854. And boy, those local Republicans decided they wanted a newspaper to counteract some of the political blasts that they were getting from the Lansing Journal. Thus, the State Republican was born. Henry Barnes, as I mentioned, was the first owner, but after 2 weeks, he sold out to a Rufus Hosmer and George Fitch. The first papers were printed in a sprawling two-story frame building at 116 West Michigan Avenue, just about where the Lansing Police Department stands now. But there would be several moves of the newspaper office during the next 94 years. Within a few months, it moved to the present site of the Michigan Theater. And a few weeks later, after another move, it burned down in the 1857 fire. So in 1858, a second building was constructed on the very same site as the first one on Michigan Avenue. Then in 1896, there was another move to the corner of North Washington Avenue in Ionia and remained there until 1915 when it moved again to the northeast corner of Grand and Ottawa. And finally in 1951, the newspaper settled in at the corner of Grand and Lenawee, where it is now awaiting another move. The State Republican oscillated between weekly, bi-weekly, tri-weekly, and daily status during its early years, depending on the editors or owners. It was a strong, community-oriented newspaper that focused on local news like meetings, businesses, church services, clubs, and people, and a few out-of-state stories that were sent in to them by telegraph. There were some ads and drawings in the paper as well, but no bylines to identify the writers who painted this community's history with their words. The same was true for nameless photographers. But eventually, in both cases, they would be recognized with the introduction of the byline in the mid-1920s. The State Republican saw a number of editors and owners walk through its door during those early years, but I tend to believe that Darius Thorpe was one of the most devoted supporters of our community. Mr. Thorpe and Frank Godfrey brought out the tri-weekly State Republican in 1886 and turned it into a daily filled with local news, and the paper began to thrive. And what happened 10 years later has never been, and probably never will be, duplicated by another newspaper owner, editor, or publisher in Lansing. In January of 1896, a small group of women, all wives of prominent Lansing businessmen, gathered at the Downey Hotel, which is where J.W. Knapp Company is now. They went for an afternoon of tea every week and a card game called whist. Well, suddenly one of the ladies fell ill with an attack of indigestion, and it sparked a conversation about hospitals. There was no hospital in Lansing in 1896. The first one, started in 1890 by the Sisters of Charity from Ohio, had closed its doors in 1893 for financial reasons. Where would someone go if they got real sick, they asked each other. And in a matter of minutes, the women made up their minds they would start one. So in May of that year, they opened the first city hospital on West Ottawa Street, then rented the John S. Moffat House on South Grand. But a few weeks later, they discovered they needed more room, so the women purchased the Mead House on North Cedar Street. They came up with a pretty sizable down payment of $500. However, they still needed to find $65 every month for the mortgage. Well, as usual, they didn't ponder that thought for very long either. They went to Darius Thorpe and struck a deal. In a front page editorial on the afternoon of November 29th, 1899, Mr. Thorpe announced that he had given the women permission to write and publish a Thanksgiving edition on November 30th, and all proceeds from its sale would go to the new hospital. No hand from that of a woman shall wield a pencil for no hand aside from that of a woman shall wield a pencil for this paper, he wrote. The women exclusively will do the work. The 4-section, 24-page paper was 15 inches wide and 22.5 inches long, slightly bigger, a little bit bigger than what our paper is today. It had local articles, a few pen and ink drawings, and ads for local businesses. And I might add, this was quite an accomplishment for these women, since women didn't even have the right to vote until 21 years later. But it was also a genuine, heartfelt achievement for the newspaper. Essentially, it was a true coming together of a community that joined hands to resolve an issue that would have a positive effect on its residents. And by the way, a copy of that paper is here on the table that you might like, a front page of the paper is here that you might like to take a look at. The paper continued to grow as we moved into the 1900s. The State Republican and the Lansing Journal merged on January 23, 1911, and published a few editions under the name of the Lansing Journal-Republican. But less than a month later, on February 13th, the paper came out with the State Journal in the masthead. The once 4-page broadsheet expanded with local stories about people like R.E. Olds, new businesses, state government, visiting dignitaries, and the war in Europe. At that time, we were also introduced to the wire services, Associated Press and United Press International. Many immigrants had begun to settle in Lansing around this time as well, including the Greeks who arrived in the early 1900s, along with the Germans, the Polish, and the Scandinavians, and others of ethnic origin. Nearly every one of their churches still exists in our city today. The Reverend Leo Serbowitz preached his first sermon in Polish in 1916 at St. Mary's Cathedral. A year later, the Reverend August P. Sater was preaching in Swedish to members of Grace Evangelical Lutheran Church, while services in German were being conducted at Emmanuel Lutheran in downtown Lansing. In the late 1930s, my Finnish-born mother began taking classes in night school so she could get her citizenship papers. The classes were taught by teachers from the Lansing School District. My mother had 3 textbooks: grammar, spelling, and constructive lessons for the foreign-born. But every student was also encouraged by the school district to read the Lansing State Journal to practice their English and acquaint themselves with their new community. My parents bought the Sunday paper because it had more pages than the weekday editions, but it also cost them 3 cents a copy. So my parents and another Scandinavian couple took turns buying it and continued to do it for many years and established a lifelong friendship in the process. The State Journal thrived in the 1940s and 50s, especially with a lot of news by local reporters and writers. Each issue had between 40 and 50 pages, and sometimes up to offerings was an historical column written by the late Bert Darling, a reporter and local historian. In 1950, he penned a book entitled City in the Forest, which captures the city's early history. And if I'm not mistaken, that book has been revised and is now available on Amazon. In 1956, around the Lansing State Journal's 100th birthday, the price of the paper was 7 cents per copy. According to statistics from the International Newswire Service, about 349 people worked in the State Journal plant in 1956. They also had 75 correspondents and scores of stringers and hundreds of other newsmen and writers around the world contributing to the paper. And 632 young people who worked very hard to make sure that every one of the 67,000 copies that were printed each day made it to a subscriber's doorstep. After 100 years, the Lansing State Journal still seemed like our paper, a community-based paper. We clipped birth records, engagement, wedding, marriage, and divorce announcements, and pasted them in our scrapbooks. We sent articles and photos to family in other cities, states, and countries so they would know what we were doing here in Lansing. And to friends and neighbors, we let them know that we read about them in the news. At its best, the State Journal was historically recording the many facets of our lives, how we lived, how we were shaped by our surroundings, and what we learned and experienced every single day. In 1956, that concept of community, set forth in those early days, was still important to us, and I think some will agree, it still is. Thank you.